In the previous part, I disassembled and prepped the keyboard shell for painting, but then what happened is that I dropped the can of orange spray paint on the floor and it broke off the tube and the nozzle bit, so I had to just leave it at that for then. So now what I've got to do right now is sand it back a bit, get a new color of paint, and then assemble it back together. So this is the state of the keyboard after a bit of painting with the orange, and with the keyboard inside of the shell. It's only got a thin layer of paint around the sides and on the bottom of the keyboard, so I don't need to do much sanding at all. I'll be using some wet and dry sandpaper to keep it smoother, I'll use 600 and 800 grit sandpaper, and since it's only a thin layer of coat of the orange paint, and I really don't want to remove the tape, I'll just do some light sanding and then go over it with more primer for the better paint adhesion. Once again, I'll be using my paintboard and my spray trigger, and most importantly my respirator mask. Looking at the shell now, you can see that it still has some orange around the tape. This is because I didn't really want to remove the tape so that the lines would stay the same and more straight. If the paint was thicker, then I would have removed the tape and sanded that off as well, but this just makes it easier so I don't affect any of the protected area with the sandpaper. Again, I'll be using my surface primer to do some light coats, a couple of times for a good coverage. With sanding lightly between coats to get rid of any imperfections and to make it really smooth. Now that it's all primed up, I can move on to painting the shell, and this time I'll be using a nice bright yellow paint that should go really well with the bright orange of the plate that the switches are mounted to. And this paint is also from Duplicata. This is the same process as priming, so it's always better to go slow and steady to save you from making really bad time-consuming mistakes. After a couple of layers, it looks good and there aren't any pieces of dust or imperfections on the shell, so now I have to protect it with some clear top coat. To protect the yellow paint, I'll be using a satin clear coat from Rust-Oleum. I prefer using satin or matte over gloss because it makes it look better and feel better in my opinion. Now that it's all dry, I can take the masking tape off and get it back together and working again. The yellow turned out really nice and the lines on the bottom are reasonably clean for me, and it looks quite cool with all the yellow switches on show. With all the tape off, I can finally put it back together. However, this is unfortunately the hardest part in the process, at least in my experience. The PCB that the wire is connected to was extremely hard to put back together, so that it lined up correctly with the connection point on the main PCB where the switches are mounted to. This is mainly because it just sits there. There's not an adequate amount of rails or guides for the thing to sit, and really I have no idea how they got it in there in the first place. As seen here, I put it back in its approximate place and I thought that I had it done, but upon testing the keyboard on the computer I couldn't get it to work. So I had to try connecting the two connection points outside of the shell to make sure it actually still works. And luckily it did still work, so I knew the two connection points weren't meeting properly when they were placed in the shell. So what I had to do is resort to using hot glue to keep the wired PCB in place. Although instead of gluing it to the main shell, I glued it to the other plastic piece which clips onto the main shell. Then you just have to line it up in the correct place. It's somewhat tedious, but you can figure it out if there's anyone actually putting it back together. After all that trouble, the final keyboard looks good with the bright yellow complementing the bright orange, and overall this keyboard is an interesting one with its shell, connection method, more compact layout and its metal plate, and in my opinion it's a decent mechanical keyboard.